Welcome to Module 19. We're well on our way to costing, and we're going to take a deeper dive into ABC, activity-based costing. We've talked a little bit about it before. It's almost like trying to do multiple single costing factors, and activity-based has a multiple bases for analyzing overhead cost. And ABC does relate to overhead cost, is a more accurate reflection on how we calculate overhead costs. And we're going to take a deeper dive, and we'll take a look at where we're headed. So let's talk about cost structures and how they're evolving, how they're changing. When we look at our cost environment, and we've talked a little bit about this before, a little bit less labor intensive, but more automated or fixed asset or more equipment intensive. So we're going to have some higher fixed costs, and we might be having some lighter employee costs or labor costs to go with that. So the time that is being used by employees are going to be, instead of on the production side, a little bit more on scheduling, a little bit more on setup, a little bit more on maintenance, a little bit more on moving materials around. So we have some different costs associated beyond the direct labor that we associated with production. So in this case, these are all overhead related. These are indirect labor as opposed to direct labor costs being added. So let's see how we apply ABC, activity-based costing. So under activity-based costing, we have something called cost objects. Each one of those objects is a separate calculation, is a separate occurrence, is a separate grouping of costs in overhead. So we have a different, and if we look back at the listing of things that we talked about, we have machine setups. Each setup, we might have 10 machine setups for production, and we might have 100 moves of materials, and we might have so many hours of maintenance, or so we actually have, for each of these categories, we have a cost per hour, a cost per setup, a cost per pound of material, or moving numbers of material transitions. So those are all costs that we are analyzing and taking a look at. Each of those would be a separate cost object, and all those costs added together would be the total overhead. But instead of using just one direct labor hour or machine hours, we're using a series of multiple objects to calculate the cost, which is a little bit more calculation intensive, but a heck of a lot more accurate when it comes to projecting overhead costs associated. So the underlying premise, the activities drive the costs, and costs should be assigned to each product or services in proportion to the volume of activity those overhead items incur. The cost object is a product or service provided to a customer, and can be a customer, based on a revenue producing event for which management wants to know the cost. So we have breakdown, it's a cost breakdown. So ABC, to fill customer needs, we have customers served by activities that are consumed, resources, and each of those have costs associated with that. Cost of resources consumed by activity should be assigned to cost objects on the basis of the units of activity consumed. So the cost of the resources are assigned to what are called activity pools, and they are reassigned to these objects as we go. It should become a little clearer the more we talk about it. So what are the steps? First, we identify the activities, most critical. Have to see which activities are involved in costing us the things that we want to include in these overhead assignments. Then we're going to assign the cost to those activities, and we're going to break it down. Each activity is going to have a grouping of set of costs. And then we determine the cost driver. Is it hours? Is it units? Is it some other measure that we can determine? Maybe inspections. There's a number of inspections and quality control. Maybe it's a different type of activity. Each activity will have its own cost driver to assign the cost to a cost object. We determine the cost per unit of activity for those subsets, and then we make a total calculation of the activity based on the cost object's volume as we consume those activities. And again, instead of one basis like direct labor hours, we're going to have a whole bunch of different cost objects and cost drivers to calculate and to maneuver. So here we go. We have activities. Stage one, indirect resource costs are assigned to activity pools. Each activity, inspections, process of bottling, process of figuring out how we are moving materials around. Maybe we're allocating based on square footage. Maybe we're allocating based on if we have manager salary or we have production. We have different ways of analyzing. And activities costs are assigned to those cost objects using those drivers. And we have to get total cost of each product, each pool that we associate that with. So we go a little further. Cost per unit, just like we did for overhead with a single cost, we had fixed cost divided by hours, total number of hours, or whatever costs were associated. Well, these are individual activities for each area, and the units associated with those cost driver, those goes to the activity pools. And again, we're going to have multiple drivers, multiple calculations. Instead of one single entry of overhead being allocated, we're going to have multiple being allocated to work in process. So what are we doing for cereal production? Total cost, we have machine setup, we have packaging and shipping, we have inspection. Those are all costs associated. These are separate activity pools that we are concerned with, and they total up to the total 37.7 to go with that. And how many batches? We get $1 per batch. We're actually figuring out our total cost. So 10 batches of Frosted Flakes were completed, $91.75 per batch times 10 batches, and we come up with our cost associated for setup in this case. So that's just one element, the setup side of things, machine setup. So we're going to be comparing, and I'm going to cut it off here, let this sink in a little bit, but we're then going to be comparing traditional and ABC methods on how this works together. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you shortly.